Okay, so hopefully people can see Intro to Python for Tech Writers. The caveat to this presentation is that if you already know Python or have been working, you already know how to code, this talk isn't really for you. I'm happy for you to be here, and you can give me feedback and tell me whether it was any good. But you might also be like, that's really basic stuff. But this is addressed primarily to myself 6 or so years ago. That's kind of like where I was trying to pitch this. And I say that because I've been in tech for 10, 15, something like a while, like maybe 10 years or more. And I tried to learn PHP because that was the thing, and then I tried to learn JavaScript because that was the thing, and I tried to learn Ruby on Rails because that was like the thing, and I did a really bad job of learning all of those things. And I discovered Python, and Python turned me into a coder, and it turned me into a tech writer. And so in some ways, this talk is extremely biased to my experience. And your mileage may vary, but how do I? Here we go. Okay, so have to do my hello world demonstration of what Python looks like. And so I want to start by sort of talking about why I think Python is a good first language, or if you've tried to learn to code in the past on any of those languages I mentioned, why maybe you should try again and use Python, especially if you're a tech writer or tech writer adjacent. You can read the slide just as well as I can, but it is very easy to learn. I think, like I said, I tried and failed several times. It's easy to read. It's easy to type. Then the thing that sort of made me a tech writer out of it is that it has excellent documentation and publishing tools. Not every tech writer deals with publishing tools, and not everybody who deals with publishing tools deals with the ones that are in Python, but there are really excellent documentation publishing tools in Python. Learning Python well enough to sort of get by and do stuff is a really good proof of tech skill. So there are, even in tech writing, jobs that you're not going to be able to get if you can't pass a coding interview. The coding interviews for tech writers are generally not as bad as for engineers, but they still are there. And the things that I've learned after discovering Python, even, like I said, after getting paid to write PHP and getting paid to write JavaScript badly, are what got me through those kinds of interviews. Python is the primary language used in machine learning, data science, and artificial intelligence, and it is also extremely useful for personal productivity. So I'm going to talk sort of about all of those individually. Python is easy to learn. It's readable. The people who design the language, their primary goal was to make a language that is easy to read. So I don't know if you've ever tried to read Java or C++, but they're very hard to read. They're just full of stuff. There's not a lot of cruft. Most of the low-level management, bit flipping, and port shunting, and all of those sorts of things are just taken care of. Common tasks like looping are taken care of in Python. Error messages in Python tend to make sense. So I want to give you an example of some of those things with this function that returns a list of vowels given a string. So I'm just going to let you look at it for a second and see if you can figure out what it's doing. I hope the point here is that I hope it's really easy to figure out what it's doing, right? You might not know already that def is the keyword for defining a function, but it should be really apparent that the vowels of is a function that takes parameter s, which is a string, and then loops through, like goes through, and every time it finds a vowel, it pulls it out. And then I hope it's also very obvious that it gives you options of what things you want to include as vowels. So, right. And then I wrote over here sort of, this is like sort of pseudo codey, but this is more or less how you'd have to write a similar thing in Java. And that's just that little loop, that for loop, for letter in S. In most languages, before the advent of like Python and Ruby, you had to do all these stupid things to loop. And they just sort of take care of it for you. So let me execute that, and then I will run this function, given the text, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. Oh no! So I got an error. Why did I get an error? Vowels equals vowels, W. Let's look for half a second. So why did it give me a error? Well, it turns out, and it kind of basically knows exactly what's happening. So it says trace, oh, you can't see it here because the screen doesn't show you the whole thing. Underneath this, it says that vowels is void. I can't, it's null, it doesn't exist. And I can come up here and figure out why, and that's because vowels extend doesn't return anything. You actually just use it directly. So now that should work. That was a bad example of how easy to read the error messages are, because you couldn't see the error message, it was off the bottom of the screen. But you get the idea. And it can take many string and it does what it's supposed to do. Okay, so more or less easy to read. Not that you're going to spend a lot of time writing code that looks like this. And you can see, like, you can also pass in the variables y and w, and it will provide, it will humor your assumption that w is not a vowel if you want it to. Another thing that I really love about Python is that it includes this thing called help. So if you're in a execution environment, you can hit help and it will give you the, like, around an object, in this case, the function, the vowels of, and it will give you the, doc string, the function signature, and the doc string. So it tells you all the things that you need to know. Now, this that I highlighted is not a lot of information about that function. So I pre-wrote this. I'm going to go back. And this is the kind of thing, when I talk about Python's wonderful documentation tools, it's not just the tools, it's also sort of the culture around the tooling. And you can do this. There's a Java doc does a similar thing, but you can include all of this information about a function when you write a function, or a method, or an object of any sort. You can write this stuff in your class definitions. And then when you come around over to help, you get all of this information. One of the reasons I'm highlighting this for technical writers is those doc strings, everything between the triple quotes, is like a lot of my job at Google, and a lot of other people's job at Google. So if you go to tensorflow.org and you poke around until you find the API reference, the API reference is generated from code out of these doc strings that look just like this, but in the TensorFlow code. So it's a very different, knowing enough Python that you can do that, or code generally, if for those of you who are like technical writers working on like instruction manuals for things, and kind of tired of writing hit save to save the file. Being able to like write in code and understand enough about how that works lets you then work in a different way as a tech writer and get more interesting jobs. So I'm off the screen. I'm kind of annoyed by being off the screen here. Um, ah, so I'm going to
You
call that
can
a slide.
reshare a different way where you share the whole screen.
It's
instead
not
of
the
just
screen. It's not the screen. It's the tool that's turning my notebook into slides. It's that. And then the other thing that I love, I adore this. Docstring, I have examples of how to use it. Well, those examples are testable. Oh, it failed. Why did it fail? So we can look and figure out why it failed. It expected one thing and got another. So this is interesting. It's expected single quotes. Sorry, it expected double quotes because I wrote double quotes, and it gets single quotes. So that's my fault for writing the docstring incorrectly. Assuming I went back and fixed it, this would pass. At Google, and not just at Google, lots of places, and I did not set it up at Google, but at other places I have set up the systems that allow you to test your documentation this way. So you write, instead of writing instructions and then hoping that they stay right over time, you're writing examples which are testable, and then when they get tested, you find out whether they're right or not, and they can be tested automatically. Like on TensorFlow, we test everything every day. So if someone commits a change to TensorFlow that breaks our examples, we find out about it right away and can either fix the examples or tell them to not make that change or whatever. So back to just sort of general Python things. Python is very easy to get started with. There's lots and lots of stuff in what's called the standard library. Standard library is essentially like, it's not the core language, but it's all the stuff that comes packaged with the core language. The standard library does everything from spinning up web servers to doing relatively high-level math, combinatorics, all sorts of stuff that you would need for most computing tasks without you having to either build it yourself or choose between 4 different implementations of tree sorting algorithms or whatever. You don't have to make those choices. They're already made for you. In addition to the standard library, which covers so much of the stuff that you'd ever need, there's lots and lots of well-maintained libraries in the pip, the Python package index. So there's, you can browse this, there's 300,000 projects. Anything that you would need. TensorFlow is pip installable. So TensorFlow shows up in the Python package index, and you can go to your command line and write pip install TensorFlow, and you have TensorFlow in your Python, and then you can write TensorFlow code. There's a relatively straightforward installation system for Python. I have set it up. I hate installing things. That is by far the thing that I hate the most of anything in computers, is installing stuff on my computer. And I've installed Python dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times. It's never gone poorly, which is a huge change from when I was trying to get PHP or Ruby on, to load back in the day. The one exception to that is that it can be a little difficult on Windows, not because it has to be, but because so much of the instructions are based in Linux. And so Linux, it works great. On Mac, which is more or less Linux. It works great. And Windows, you kind of have to read a little bit more and push past the fact that the instructions that you're looking at are not for you. But it is totally doable. My brother, who is a church musician, a better one than I am, is learning Python. He wants to get a job as a software engineer, and he is using it on Windows, and it's working out just fine for him. And then the other thing that I want to highlight about how easy it is to sort of get started is that you can use Jupyter notebooks or Google Colab notebooks to try things out. So if you've ever tried to learn how to code and you were like, you read the book and it was like, here, do this, write the hello world, blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, where do I type it? And how do I run it? And where is the output going to be? Those are all serious questions that I had. But you can just go to colab.research.google.com. You can get a new notebook and you will be running Python. You don't even have to install anything. And you can print hello brave new world. And it executes. It takes a second to connect to spin up a server, and you're writing Python. And you can do all the things that you ever wanted to do in Python, like print loops and do all the stuff. It just works. You don't have to install Python. You can play with it. A side note and plug for my company, you can do this with TensorFlow. All of our TensorFlow documentation is written in notebooks just like this. So you can look at it online, or you can actually open it in this environment and run TensorFlow code that we've written and see how it works, and then and play with it to your heart's content. Jupyter notebooks are the same idea, but you run the Python server yourself. So that's a little bit more like you have to already have gotten to the point of being able to install it locally or whatever. So that's a little bit on, it's very easy to get started. Like you can just start playing with Python right away before you take the time to install it. You can try out the syntax. If you're trying to learn especially for like a coding interview, you can just open up Colab and do it. Proof of skill. I mentioned this already. A lot of tech writing and adjacent jobs require knowledge in, and I quote, at least one programming language. And there's usually a list. So if you have ever looked at technical writing job posts, there is almost always the following language. Proficiency in one or more of the following programming languages. And then there's a list, and it goes like C++, Java, JavaScript, Python, or something like that. And Python is by far the most commonly listed language on that list. And well, you could ask why that is, and the reason is because of the way it gets used. So if the job is documenting applications, right, it's going to be like C, C++, Java, Python, maybe a few other things. If it's utility scripting languages, you're shunting data around, you're doing ETL on databases, it's going to be Python, Perl, and Bash. If it's web development, it's going to be JavaScript, PHP, Python, and Ruby, and a few others. Pardon?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I'm messing. My bad.
Okay.
Sorry about
and
that.
if it's if it's a data science job, it'll be R and MATLAB and Python. So because of Python's versatility, it shows up right in all of these different lists. I haven't found a job that wasn't actually the job was coding, that required coding where Python wasn't on the list. I'm sure they exist, but I find that it's always on the list. And the one exception, it's off my screen, is mobile development. If your heart is set on mobile development, this talk is not for you. I'm sorry. I don't know why. I don't know what all the reasons are for it, but nobody's really like super into Python for mobile development. I'm sure it's possible, probably is possible, but it's not what people do with it. Documentation tooling. just a few catalog items here. So PyDoc and DocTest are built in. They are part of the they're part of the standard library, and what I showed you is sort of an example of that. Like you're just able to easily write documentation on the stuff at the place where the stuff was coded. It's very, very helpful. Sphinx is essentially a content management system, but rather than having all of your documentation, all of the text stored, if you're familiar with WordPress, for example, in like a MySQL database, your documentation is stored as text files in like a code repository. So you can treat your documentation as code, so it can be versioned, it can be released, like in sync with the code, and you can test it. I set up in two places I worked. I set up like text linting. So if someone committed changes to the documentation repository, it would check for like common misspellings and branding errors and stuff like that. We do that at Google. I did not set it up, so it works better than the ones that I did. But it's a very common approach to code today. And then Jupyter Notebooks. What you're experiencing right now is a Jupyter Notebook. All of this, looks like a PowerPoint presentation or whatever, but I have runnable code that I can just hit a button and it executes. This is amazing for developer relations. You want to give presentations. This is not a very code-heavy presentation, but you can imagine if you are tasked with giving talks about whatever your technology is, that this can be extremely useful. And then I want to mention, on a personal note, that I got most of my jobs because of this stuff. I got really interested in treating docs as code about 4 or 5 years ago, like that phrase, docs as code. The reason is I was writing a lot. I was a freelance writer for like a content mill. I was writing like nickel a word articles for search engine optimization. And I didn't know how to do any of these things, but I hated writing in Word documents. I hated writing code samples in Word documents. I hated sort of everything about the way I was writing. And most especially, I really hated copying and pasting affiliate links from one place to another. And so I very slowly, and this is literally how I learned Python, is I very slowly learned how to generate text in Python and how to manipulate web browsers so that I could get the affiliate links directly and then have them immediately inserted into the text I was working on, and then lint the stuff and then automatically send it to my editor. So I took jobs that were previously taking me all day and were paying me whatever, $100 or $200 for like a ton of work, and got it down to something I could do in 20 or 30 minutes. And once I did that and started talking about docs as code, and this is a secret, this is like one secret trick that recruiters don't want you to know about. If you talk about docs as code, if you know this stuff, there's a whole class of jobs, particularly at startups, that you can get that you were previously had no idea existed. I've started, after I worked at the freelance place for a while, I got to a point in my life where I was like, I need a real job. So I started looking for real jobs. I had a really shitty job for like 6 weeks at Google or at Facebook, like 6 weeks at Facebook. That was really bad. And they fired me after 6 weeks, and I went home on Friday and I answered a phone call from a recruiter for a startup, and I talked to them a little bit, and they said, like, they asked me what I'm interested in and what kind of tech writing I do, and I talked about docs as code, and I just sort of acted like I actually had done that before and whatever. But that was the reason they hired me, and I made a joke, and I was like, if you want me to come to work on Monday, you're gonna have to call me over the weekend, right? You can't wait till Monday to hire me. And I got a job by Monday morning. So knowing this stuff made me like 1,000 times more employable than I had been previously. I have not lacked for a job since I learned how to do this stuff and started talking about documentation this way. And it is ultimately what got me onto the TensorFlow team at Google, because this is how they treat documentation. And they didn't need me to come set it up or be an engineer or anything like that. But I had done that at several startups that had no documentation publishing, and I set these systems up and got them going. And TensorFlow does all that stuff. And so they hired me because I knew that stuff. And you too can have this journey for yourself. So another avenue for jobs is data science and machine learning. The two big names in machine learning right now are TensorFlow and PyTorch. Both of those more or less do the same thing in different ways, but they're both Python projects. People are moving away from proprietary things like MATLAB and using Python. They're using TensorFlow, they're using PyTorch, they're using scikit-learn, they're using NumPy, they're using Jupyter notebooks. Python is the language of data science and machine learning, and if you want a job in that sector, that's where you want to be. Your constant. I do not remember why I put cloud services and data on my bullet points on this slide. I have no idea what that's about. I'm sure it's relevant. Another reason, this is still in the why should you bother to learn Python as opposed to something else. The thing that I have been trying to tell people over and over again, I argued with my brother about this for a year. If you half learn Java and don't become a Java programmer, there's literally nothing you're ever going to do with that Java knowledge, ever, never. The same is true for C. JavaScript, maybe a little bit. But Python is useful. It's useful immediately for things that normal people do who aren't programmers. I already told this story about how I cut a writing task from 5 hours to like less than an hour. I wasn't being paid to code. I was being paid to produce text. Coding made me able to accomplish that so much faster. It did not, however, catch this typo, so that's interesting. So that is the why. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. We started at 7:30, 7:15.
We started at around 7:15. So we're doing great.
So we're about half an hour. Okay. So that's all the why. I hope I've convinced you. If you don't know Python at all, I'm going to just do a very, very quick catalog of some of the features that I think are interesting or worthwhile or worth mentioning. So there's a bunch of basic types that are extremely straightforward and easy to understand, right? Booleans are true or false. A string is a bunch of letters. An integer is a number. A float is a type of number. A complex number is a type of number, right? A few things that are worth noticing, especially if you've tried other languages and were pissed off at how stupid they were. A list is a bunch of things. It's an ordered collection of stuff. The ordered collection doesn't all have to be the same thing. Could be strings and numbers and anything else. You don't have to ahead of time know how many items are going to be in your list and declare it. You don't have to use for I equals blah 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 in order to iterate through a list. You can just do it. A dictionary is what in many other languages is called a hash table, right? It maps keys to values. Again, you don't have to ahead of time know how many items are you going to be in your dictionary. You can use any number of things as keys. Your keys can be numbers, they can be strings. There's like some oddly specific rules about what can and can't be a key, but it's basically all the things that you would ever want to be a key can be keys. And that maps to values, and then you can, get something when you ask for it. Like at the beginning of my presentation when I had like, name is such and such. A set is a collection in which everything is unique. So if I tried to add another one, it wouldn't fail. It would just, nothing would change about the set. But if I added 5, and a tuple is like a list, but can't be it's static. It can't be changed once you've created it. So tuples are really useful for like XY coordinates or XYZ coordinates, or anything that's like a unit of something. If Python didn't already include complex numbers, you would use tuples to make complex numbers. I'm building a math library or a music library that treats notes as tuples, and so like there's each sort of piece of the tuple is of some aspect of the note. Easy to read representations of things. So this is just sort of integer. Oh, because I didn't run this. I have to run that. Now I can see that was really straightforward. It's not defined. Very straightforward. Error messages. Easy to read representations. What is this integer? It's a 9. What is this complex number? It's 3 plus 4. It uses j instead of I for the imaginary part. You can just imagine. J is just an I with a longer stroke. A list, right? And when you build like sort of your own custom types, classes, you can like specify what these representations look like. It makes it much easier to read and write other people's code. Looping is very normal, right? Not totally insane. You don't have to use indexes and check conditions and all of this stuff that you have to do in many other languages. It's worth noting, if anybody in the room is like skeptical because they learned C++ like 40 years ago, all of that, the optimization, the stuff that makes like those things really fast because you're using these indexes and doing all this complex stuff, that's all happening under the hood in Python. So you lose a little bit in the, Python to C to assembly, but not a lot. More sane looping, right? So while some condition is true, do some stuff. And then if at any point you set the condition to false, then it stops looping. Side note, this is how like a lot of games work. In fact, most games run on a loop, right? And it checks, now it's this person's turn, it's this person's turn, it's this person's turn, it's this person's turn. Or like action loops. It's also how web servers work. They're like looping, constantly waiting to see if something happens. Then like a trigger happens, and when it gets around to that point in the loop, it notices the trigger. It's how your keyboard works. Obviously those things aren't written in Python, but it's a good thing to know. More sane looping. What about dictionaries? I can get things by key, I can get things by value, I can get the keys and the values all at the same time. And this stuff, like, I don't know if you're like, oh, that seems really straightforward. If you've tried to do these things and do the kind of stuff that I'm talking about with like text shunting or like useful just scripting in other languages, this stuff is very, very difficult. Not very difficult, just time consuming. It's got first class functions, right? So you can tell it to do something, right? Is something even? Modulo equals 0, then it's even, otherwise false. And then ask it. We could write, a doc string in here. Returns true if n is even. And then we could ask it for help. It has classes, so you can do object-oriented programming. Under the hood, everything's an object. Actually, even above the hood, everything's an object. So if you're familiar with object-oriented approaches, so it's essentially like I can create data types which also do things and keep all my stuff together. This is how most programming works today in um, in practice. And then I can ask it, right, for that stuff. I feel like I had an example of like changing the last four, but I don't remember. If you're like coming from Java and you're like, well, what about private classes and stuff? That happens. Here, I can't actually access last four directly. It doesn't exist. So the features that make Java a safe programming language exist in Python as well. They work a little bit differently, but also you should just write better documentation and trust people instead of stopping them from doing things. So here's I think the most important part of this talk is how to learn Python, because you didn't just now actually learn Python. I think people try to learn programming languages all the wrong ways. So I'm just gonna talk about better ways, I hope. There are two books that are worth reading. One is called Automate the Boring Stuff, and then the other is then Beyond the Basic Stuff, and then 3, Fluent Python. I would read these and work through them in that order if you like books, if you're a book person. The reason I would start with Automate the Boring Stuff is that it teaches you to do all of the file shunty, making playlists, generating text, scraping web pages, all the stuff that you might ever in your life want to do other than get paid to write code with Python. So at the end of it, you'll know some Python, and also you'll have some useful skills that will never leave you. And then the same author wrote Beyond the Basic Stuff. And then my absolutely favorite book about Python is by Luciano Ramallo called Fluent Python. If you just like read a chapter and like work through the examples, a chapter a day, in 3 months, you'll know as much Python as I do. If you are super if you'd rather do an online course, edX has an introduction to Python programming as part of a professional certificate. And I want to highlight for anybody who's trying to figure out what they're going to do when they grow up, that the edX's certificate is recognized by Georgia Tech's Online Masters in Computer Science as a proof that you know enough programming to succeed in that program. So if you've been eyeing online master's programs or online bachelor's programs, and you're like, I want to get a computer science degree, first off, I highly recommend Georgia Tech. That's just a side thing. It's affordable and it's highly recognized. My dad, who is a software engineer in Florida, calls it the MIT of the South. And their online program is really excellent. But you have to prove to get in. You have to prove that you can program, and one of the ways you can do that is through this edX course. And then books are great, courses are great, but the way that you're actually going to learn a programming language is to start using it to solve real problems. So whatever the PHP version of those books are, I read already. And the Ruby on Rails versions, and like I just actually cleared out my garage. As you can clearly tell, it's so cleared. And I have like all these books on JavaScript and PHP and C++, and I tried over and over again, and it wasn't until I had a thing that I wanted to accomplish, that like I was desperate to actually solve, that I started solving real programming problems. So I urge you, if you are like on the fence, or you're like, I've always wanted to learn coding, find something in your life that would be better if there was code written for it. And instead of doing yet another search for like free and open source versions of the software, like maybe somebody somewhere made the crossword puzzle solver that you've always wanted, just make it yourself. Like figure it out. And like it'll be really bad. It'll be terrible, but you will have figured out something. The code that I wrote to automate my writing processes 6 or 7 years ago is bad. I looked at it recently. It's bad, but it worked, and I learned stuff. And then I got the next job, and then I learned a little bit more, and then I got the next job, and I learned a little bit more. So that's how you learn programming languages, not just from reading books over and over. And I say that again, as I said, this talk is to myself. I read a lot of books, just like the little toy programs, trying to like get some sense of how to do anything, and I never really got there. That's everything I had written for my talk. I am happy to talk about any of these or other things for Q&A, or other things, I guess, if stuff comes up. But if you want to ask me about church music or my electric saxophone, maybe wait for the other people who want to talk about the things that are relevant. I hope that was helpful.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. Thank you.
Yeah,
That was
thanks, Adam.
awesome. Let's go into the Q&A period. Most of the questions in the chat, in the Zoom chat, were actually there's a lot here that's people's recommendations for a course, a book,
Wonderful.
a website, a video. You know, there's a lot of stuff here. People chiming in with, here's where I learned, or here's what the best resource I found.
Excellent.
I'm not going to get involved in the discussion of how old is C++, not my department. So let's
I didn't
open it
even
up
look at the
for-
comments. Everything I said is my own opinion, and you are all welcome to yours.
Well, you don't have to look for the comments when you're presenting, so don't worry about it. Here's a question just coming in from Dave in the chat. He says,
Sure.
Could you please explain what you automated with Python when you were
Sure.
starting? Because I think your point was well taken, that you're going to learn best when you have an actual problem to solve. Like it's going to actually make your life better.
Sure. I'll tell the story that I summarized quickly earlier. So I was writing, I was being paid essentially by like piecework to write for a content mill that made their money doing affiliate advertising through search engine optimization. And it was all related to web hosting. So they were selling like Bluehost, right, or whatever, HostGator, that sort of thing. The website is called Who is Hosting This? I'm still probably the most prolific writer on Who is Hosting This. And there were a lot of different types of content that we wrote, but the thing that was really upsetting me were these listicles, essentially. So we take some topic like how to learn Python, and then we'd write 2 paragraphs on what Python is and why, and then there would be a tree of resources, like just like a massive number of resources. And that would be like websites, courses, and Amazon affiliate links and reference material and all of this stuff, right? And what I was doing, and what every other person who wrote these things for this company was doing, was, you'd do a Google search and you'd open up 100 tabs and you'd look at them and you'd figure out if this was a good one, and then you'd copy and paste the URL into your document, and this would go on, and it just took forever. And so what I wrote was a script. It used what is that thing called? Beautiful Soup is an HTML parser built into that you can get in Python, and I think Python's own built-in like web HTTP request stuff. And I would sit at my command line. You know what a command line is, terminal, and I would type in the name of my program, and it would come up and it would ask me what topic am I writing on. I would put in the topic and I would put in a list of what I thought were relevant keywords. It would then go to Google and get whatever, I don't know, 200 links. It would just automate through like 20 pages of search results and then put them in a queue, and then it would bring them up on a, I had like in a second window, it would bring up the website or the whatever, and then I could make a judge. I could glance at it. I could make a quick judgment about whether it was good or not, and I'd hit yes or no, and I'd give it a ranking, like 1 to 9 of whether it was like how good I thought it was. I would store that information, right? And then if it was good enough, or if I said yes, it would prompt me to write a 2-sentence summary of it, which is what I had to do for this job. So I'd write my 2-sentence summary of the thing, and then it would bring up the next one, and it would bring up the next one, and it would bring up the next one, and bring up the next one. And then, for the so we also were doing Amazon affiliate links. So once it got through all the sort of like the general stuff from Google, it would go specifically to Amazon, do the same type of search, get a list of 100 products, and then bring them up one at a time. And I would sit at the command line, and I would just like rate, type of summary, rate, type of summary, rate, type of summary. And then at the end, it would spit out my completed article, formatted appropriately with all the HTML tags that it needed, with my, and categorized, because we were supposed to do it. So like one of the things I did in the interface was like I would say which category it belonged to. Organized by category, organized by ranking, and put the more important ones at the top of each category. Have my little 2-sentence explanation. If I had kept at that company, I probably would be at the point now where I was automating even the writing of summaries and that sort of stuff, because you can do that with machine learning. So I have ADHD also, and so this was another like just the task of like copying and pasting was so dull that even if it didn't need to take me all day, it did. And the like here's the next thing being like pushed at me from the program made it such a more pleasant experience, and I got stuff done a lot faster with less typing and less repetitive stress injuries. So yeah, that's
It
the very.
sounds like a big improvement.
It was a
Like a huge.
hugely
You still
wonderful.
have to have the human element of like the making the judgment about whether this is a useful resource.
Yeah, so
But
I was not.
It's given you like a
yeah.
form to fill out. And
yeah, it was giving me, it was like automating all the boring stuff, and letting me do editorial rather than copy and pasting. It's maybe the most useful bit of code I've ever written. And it's really ugly and really bad. But I got it done, and it was like one line at a time. I like figured out what's the next thing I need to know, and then I had to go like read for an hour to figure out how to do the one thing, and then I'd write the one line. And
I can see how you were highly motivated. It's like, you learn how to fix your sink if your sink is totally broken and you really need to fix.
Yeah, and it was like, well, if I could spend 2 days on it, then it'll, the big,
and then I'll have a working
huge
sink
rewards.
and it'll make my life better. Hey, here's another question from chat, also from Dave. Does Google still let you get to the top 200 search results without solving a CAPTCHA? One of those little robot things.
I don't feel like I understand your. You're talking about because I had automated the tool. So an interesting thing about the way I did the automation is that every website that it went to was being shown to me live. It wasn't like underneath the surface. So if a website needed any human interaction, in order to function properly, I could do that interaction on the little window that it brought up. Because I was also reviewing like all this stuff. Now I wasn't reviewing the pages of search results, but I was doing it. I was operating my own human browser, and one of the ways Google search results, one of the ways that's like Google CAPTCHA works is not just like, can I find all the cars or read the curly letters. It's also like it looks at your browser and kind of sniffs whether it's a human's browser. I was using my own browser. I had like hooked Python into scripting my own human stuff, so it still looked like a human, other than the fact that I was looking at 200 web pages a minute. It mostly looked human.
Well, I might have that many tabs open just because I'm lazy.
Yes.
Are there any other questions that folks want to come out with? You don't have to put it in chat. You can also actually unmute yourself
Yes,
and speak.
I love hearing people's voices and talking.
There are humans on this call. There are 30 something.
And I'm happy to talk
40
about
something.
whatever career stuff. I think there's a few things that I'm good at, and one of them is sort of tech writer careerism. So if you have questions about that sort of thing,
Right, and after the Q&A, we also have a time for people to announce job openings or to announce themselves as looking for work. Someone's got their hand up. Saloni, you want to go ahead?
Yes, hi. Thanks so much, Adam. This has been a great presentation. My question is, I wanted to know, I'm curious about what the interview process was like at Google.
Oh, sure. So I will, if you contact Google and talk to a recruiter, they'll tell you almost exactly what I'm going to tell you. So there's an initial screening at the level of, so if you apply for a job, go to, I was about to say google.com, but that can't possibly be right. Careers.google.com or something. Or go to an event. If you go to like Write the Docs in Portland or something like that, there will be Google recruiters. That's actually how I got into that process. So you end up talking to a recruiter. They do some initial screenings and sort of check the box stuff with your resume and, talk to you, make sure you're a human. And then there's a screening interview with a hiring manager. At least there was in my case. I think that's typical. So I talked to someone who would potentially hire me. It wasn't who I ended up working for, but it was a hiring manager who could potentially hire me. And that was a pretty low-key conversation. It actually happened at a Write the Docs event because we were scheduled to meet later, and we found out we were both going to be at the same place. And then if you kind of check all the boxes and you're not a total weirdo or the right kind of weirdo, after the sort of screening interview, you end up coming in for a day-long series of interviews. It's like 5 or 6 interviews. It takes all day. I should have mentioned prior to that, one of the sort of check the boxes in the screening thing is a portfolio. So your recruiter will send you a document that sort of explains what they're looking for as far as portfolio examples of your writing. And one of the things that's really nice is if you don't have any that you can share, they do understand that and will provide you with things that you could write, right? So a lot of the stuff that I had written wasn't quite right for Google, and the stuff that was right for Google was like proprietary and I couldn't show them. So I showed them a couple things, and then I wrote based on their prompt like a actually I don't know if I can tell you what I wrote. They were like, here's a prompt, like explain how to do X thing, and I did it, and I wrote instructions for how to do a thing. So that was my portfolio. So that's part of the screening process. Then you go into interviews, and there's a series of interviewers who are each interviewing you for some qualification, right? So Googliness, which means like, are you a leader? Are you, a kind person? Are you like a team player? That sort of thing. Technical knowledge. So there'll be like a conversation about technical knowledge, asking you about whatever technology that you've used and trying to basically, I looked at it as like, they're trying to make sure that what I said on my resume was all true. There was a coding interview, which was actually not very difficult. It was more reading code than it was writing. It wasn't like algorithms and stuff because tech writers don't write a ton of code. But it was because it was a tech writer job, it was like read some code. I think it was written in Java, and explain what it does, like figure out what the code does without any documentation, and then explain that to the interviewer. And then there was also a mistake in it, and so you kind of have to figure out what it's supposed to do, and then realize that it doesn't do that, and then figure out how to fix it. At least that's how it was for me. And then I talked to a couple, like one of the interviewers was a tech writer, and they just wanted to, talk to me about my philosophy of tech writing and my tech writing experience, and went through some of the things in my portfolio and asked me why I made the choices I made, and stuff like that. And then everybody who interviews you begins the interview by apologizing that they're going to take notes, and they spend the entire time typing really, really fast. And the reason for that is that none of the people who interview you are the people who make the decision. All of the notes and everything that happened is reported in as neutral a fashion as possible, is recorded and then sent to a committee of people who review all of those things without seeing your face, your gender, your race, your age, your name, right? They see none of that. They only see the stuff that, like, what were your responses to these questions and what was the content of your portfolio. And then those people, it's called hiring committee, make the decision of whether to hire you or not. And then once you get through hiring committee, then you get an offer, and then they find you a hiring manager with a job opening that fits your role. So I ended up, there were like a handful of tech writer jobs that needed somebody at the time that I got through hiring committee, and I, like, one after the other didn't sound that interesting to me, and then they said TensorFlow, and I, like, jumped out of my pants and got really excited. And
So Adam, you have some, once you're at the hiring committee level, the candidate, that's you, has some say in which of these teams you end up in?
After you make it through hiring committee and the decision has been made that yes, you are going to be made an offer for a role, then I want to say this is what happened to me, and I don't know if it is always what happens. I was the recruiter or somebody on their team or whatever, said, you're a go for hire, great, and then said, we've got these openings for tech writer, and it was like, something on Chrome related to something, the speedy page of things, Nest, which I got zero interest in, some other, like, Google Assistant voice thing, and I was like, I don't really want to do that. And then they, and I would have done one of those things, I'm sure, but they, after like a couple of emails, I got, like, TensorFlow's interested, and I was, like I said, I got really excited, and even though I lived in Berkeley, and I thought I was going to go to San Francisco and work on the cloud team, I ended up living in Berkeley and commuting all the way to Mountain View because TensorFlow wanted to hire me. So I was really excited about that and was not going to pass up that opportunity.
Okay. Well, thanks for the good question, Saloni, and the explanation, Adam. I think we should move on to because we're a little bit over time, move on to the sort of job section. I want to open the floor to, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Just one last thing. My LinkedIn, I don't know if it's at the top of this thing or not. My LinkedIn is my name, Adam Michael Wood, and if you, I have my Twitter handle. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll get a lot of church music stuff and Episcopalian arguments. But if you go to LinkedIn, if you find me on LinkedIn, you can, I think that I'm pretty good, like I said, at careerism. If you want like a resume review or like advice about a thing, you should also, if you're looking for jobs, you should talk to Andrew Davis, who is in this chat.
Who's on this call?
Who's on this call. But if you want like a non-professional opinion, I can provide it.
Thanks. That's a good suggestion. Anytime somebody says that they're offering to like help you review your resume, anybody on this call who's looking to who's on the job market or who's looking to change careers should take them up on it.
I'll say specifically, my resume format came from Andrew Davis.
Very good to know.
I changed my resume 5 or 6 years ago. He told me how to write a resume. I wrote a resume exactly that way, and then I got a job.